Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for tuning into today's webinar. I'm Becca Parkinson. I'm Marketing Coordinator at Manchester University Press, the publisher of this book. Before I introduce today's speakers, just to do a quick bit of housekeeping, this event is being recorded. As you've come into the webinar, you've been put on mute and your camera is currently off, so you won't be on the screen or on the recording. We ask you to please keep your mics muted so as not to interrupt the speakers. If you have a question or a comment, please use the menu to the side of the screen. You'll see a heading for chat. You can post any comments or questions in there and we will come to them at the end. And lastly, you will receive an email after this event with a discount code for the book if you would like to purchase a copy of it after this enlightening discussion that we're about to have. So without further ado, let's begin. I will now introduce and hand over to the authors of Development, Architecture and the Formation of Heritage in the Late 20th Century Iran, A Vital Past, Ali Mozaffari and Nigel Westbrook. Thank you, Ali and Nigel.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you all for being here. We would also like to thank Manchester University Press for facilitating this webinar come launch, and Robert Byron and his colleagues at MUP, and of course Rebecca and her colleagues for organizing this event. We became interested in the topic in the context of Iran. That's the topic of development and heritage and architecture, because it provides an interesting and important case of the interconnection of these phenomena. Like other developing parts of the world, Iran was in this period exposed to critical historical change. Oops, yeah. In emphasizing critical historical change, we are referring to places where the speed and magnitude of change generate massive social and cultural shifts. As a result, they catalyze transformation that may at times appear anachronistic. The anachronism is most apparent when real or imagined conceptions of the past and its traditions are invoked in various forms, explicitly or otherwise, to render the present legible while responding to identity concerns. Now, here in this slide, you see two of those critical moments, or two images that symbolize those critical moments. On the left, there is the image of the revolution, which deposed the monarchy. And on the right, there's another revolution called the White Revolution, as we shall explain later on in 1963. Here and in the book, Iran is an interesting case in point, where in the latter part of the 20th century, rapid development and serious concerns for identity were concurrently on the march. It was along that march that the Islamic Revolution of 1979 exploded into the scene with a powerful identitarian agenda and prompted historical change of its own kind. This is why Iran is an excellent example of the relationship between heritage and historical change, and ultimately the built environment. It has been a developmental context undergoing socio-cultural change, and the magnitude of that change and its effects are perceivable within the intergenerational and generational memories. In fact, the upheaval of 1979 occurred following an unprecedented wave of sustained economic growth. Here in this slide, we've put together as a comparative example, Korea, which then later on turned to be the powerhouse of Asian economy, and Iran. And as you can see, in those decades, Iran had very comparable, slightly higher rate of growth. Although this sustained economic growth was peaking with the oil boom early in the decade of the 70s, it was also fueled by economic management and planning cycles devised by the state apparatuses since the 1960s, and the so-called White Revolution, which was a set of state-driven reform measures inaugurated in 1963. Together, these formed a massive suite of socioeconomic and cultural reform programs. These changes, that is the White Revolution, economic growth, and the advent of the Islamic Revolution, all prompted massive population displacements. Unprecedented growth in both urban and fringe settlements followed, with concomitant cultural displacement. Such displacement and urbanization raised demands for infrastructure and housing to mitigate and facilitate transitioning from the village lifestyle and its mode of production to the one more suited to cities and industrial compounds, such as company towns. Country was, after all, modernizing and developing. This process points to the inextricable, but at times neglected link between culture and development. Here and in the book, we are drawing attention to the cultural work that development does and has memory-related components, especially at the collective level, as it engages perceptions and conceptions of pasts. It is through this that development relates to culture and via that to heritage. In Iran, one could trace this relationship back to the early decades of the 20th century. However, the book focuses on the period between the 1960s, when the economic plans begin to yield results and concerns for identity and tradition rise, and the advent of the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and its repercussions till the 2000s. This period marks the change from a monarchy to an Islamic republic. So as you can see in this diagram, we've got some momentous periods, but we've also got two revolutions that are happening. Following others, in the book we argue that culture is highly malleable, constantly reproduced and formed through various encounters at different scales. Development is a globalizing and universalizing project which manifests differently and unpredictably in different contexts. The book's contribution is that it speaks to the relationship between development, the built environment, and heritage, as we're attempting to show in this little cyclical diagram here. As development unfolds in place, it prompts temporal displacements, followed by a renewed assessment of the past and its traditions. An important byproduct of this process is heritage, which we take it as the use of the past, real or imagined, for the purposes of the present and as a roadmap to possible futures. Thus understood, heritage is inextricably linked to historical change and development. In other words, it's not an essential thing, and as you can see, it's produced through a process. It's processual. Architecture is an interesting register for heritage-development relationship as a duo, because it embodies modes of habitation, situates social experience, and reflects technological norms. We propose that heritage, in the context of built environment, is created through intentional practices of design where the past is reimagined, incorporated in concrete forms. And here we've got some examples as various manifestations of the past and present, and my co-author will now speak to those.
From the 1960s onward, heritage was actively pursued through design and further transformed after the 1979 revolution. This was facilitated through major international exchanges, a focus on the question of culturally appropriate housing, and the search for official expressions of collective identity. We will spend most of the remaining time today on exchanges as the fundamental driver of change, and in the end, we'll show you a couple of examples of the projects. The period between 1969 and 1960 and 1979 is marked by an increase in various state-sponsored projects addressing issues of cultural identity. On the one hand, a new generation of foreign-trained architects and academics was returning home, bringing their international networks, affiliations, and Western-oriented or Western-derived ideas. On the other hand, the Iranian establishment was becoming increasingly aware of cultural schisms and problems caused by development. And this manifested itself in a stronger attention to Iranian and Islamic identity and traditions. Concurrently, there was a rising tide of third worldism and nativism amongst the intelligentsia. The Pahlavi state fostered many forms of exchange in industrial, cultural, and social arenas, notably 3 important international architectural congresses held in Iran between 1970 and 1976. Now, these had a clear agenda of examining regional and national identities, developing versus developed economies, and appropriate responses to development, and differential rates of modernization. These congresses consolidated the momentum that was appearing on the ground in relation to architecture, Iranian identity, and approaches to tradition. Through encounters between various local and international participants, an architectural and by extension, cultural heritage was produced in the hope of forming or strengthening a cultural common ground between experts, the technocrats, the people, and the state, one that had been undermined by the rapid change and displacement. And I'll hand you back to my colleague Ali.
Thank you. This paved the ground for new interpretations of the past. The inaugural Congress in 1970 was opened by the Queen, the lovely lady you see there, who emphasized the ancient heritage of Iran and the need to find a solution to reconciling traditions with rapid advances. Signaling a de facto move from traditions to heritage, this Congress developed into a vibrant forum for exchange of ideas where Iranians and their foreign counterparts divided into 3 main camps in terms of their approach to traditions. First one was traditionalists, who insisted on universality and immutability of traditions. A second group was advocates for a modern interpretation of traditions. And finally, there were those who suggested that traditions had been unmoored and they were thus irretrievable. The discussions in the congresses reveal an official attempt to grapple with the entanglements represented by development. This is apparent in the key foci of the 3 congresses, which included a focus on the relationship between tradition and technology, along with advocating the search for a local identity, a concern for globalizing Iran's culture and engaging with modernization. So it's not just from outside in, but it's also from inside looking outward. Workshopping new ideas towards practical solutions, focus on folk art and architecture in line with a similar trend in the West, positing traditional architecture and cities as models for emulation in new culturally appropriate designs, and finally, the education of the built environment broadly understood. In seeking answers to questions such as the culture-development relationship, paying attention to locality, and searching for practical solutions, these congresses would foreshadow debates that were formulated and theorized in the coming decades. In the attempt to cope with an unpredictable future, the congresses encouraged a search for new material in the past, invoking them to inform the design of appropriate architecture through which cultural problems associated with development might be ameliorated or overcome. Through these selective reproductions of the past, an Iranian heritage was imagined and popularized through architecture. These encounters had repercussions inside Iran and abroad, and my colleague will tell you about the experimentations that happened in this context.
Within Iran, experimental projects drew upon and reinterpreted the past, leaving a lasting impression on the practice and education of architecture and urbanism. Now, this is a project which continued well after the revolution of 1979. The example you see here is the Shushtano industrial housing project. It was a new town initially built for workers of the Karun agri-industrial complex in southern Iran. But subsequently, it took on other residents, including refugees during the war with Iraq. The project was designed by the Queen's cousin, Kamran Diba. While the architect Diba had to flee the Islamic Republic for fear of persecution, the project itself won a prestigious Agarkhan Award for Islamic architecture as a supposedly exemplary Islamic cultural habitat. Now, this occurred in their 1984-86 prize-giving cycle. The problem of culturally appropriate housing and the politics of heritage that sustain it remained unresolved after the revolution and continues in Iran to this day. Now, a strand of Iranian public architecture predated these debates and was invigorated by them. The famous Shahyad Tower, now known as the Azadi or Freedom Monument, is a testament to the production of heritage through design in a process of collaboration between an Iranian architect, Hossein Amanat, and a pioneering foreign engineering firm over Arab who were fresh from working on the Sydney Opera House. The global movements of ideas and techniques in this project produce a particular language that invokes memories of a past, but which becomes a site of memory in its own right as the building lives through history. In a way, this and other structures like it embody a future's past, one that is made relationally and shifts with scale from the local to the national to the international, as evidenced by the reactions of various groups of people we interviewed. Intended to symbolize the nation's future, it has now, ironically, become a site of nostalgia. Ideas, methods, and know-how are in constant circulation between the global and the local. The exchanges in Iran also had international repercussions. For example, the Congress's debates led to a document, the Habitat Bill of Rights, which was presented by the Iran delegates to the inaugural United Nations Conference on Human Settlements held in Vancouver in 1976, and which formed the impetus for the ongoing United Nations Habitat Conferences. They also consolidated the idea of an intrinsically Islamic heritage and, of course, of an intrinsically Islamic architecture by emphasizing notions of belonging to place and by rejecting globalization, ideas that played out during the Cold War era and in the West were connected with the coming critical regionalism. I'll hand you back to my colleague, Ali, to finish.
The advent of the Islamic Revolution dealt a blow to the status quo. Within the sphere of culture, it caused what may be described as a flattening of heritage. Ideological emphasis on Islamic identity, coupled with anti-Westernism, turned into a full rejection of global connections, which was then equated falsely with the West. The valorization of religious traditions, influenced by strands of Western counter-Enlightenment thought, rebooted the dialectic between tradition and heritage, resulting in the past and its traditions being reimagined once again. In the coming decade, figurative expressions of Islamic heritage were reserved for structures with a religious affiliation. The picture that you see here is called the Grand Mosalla of Tehran, which is, the name would suggest it's reserved for saying prayers, but it's also for other religious and, oddly enough, non-religious or secular events, including book shows and sports shows and the rest. And it's somehow remains unfinished, reminding us of Sagrada Familia. In it being unfinished, I mean, not in the quality of architecture, of course. By the 1990s, overt expressions of Islamic identity in secular buildings, such as public housing, had been abandoned. This is, you can see, for example, the picture on the left here. This has attracted criticism. The new architecture, however badly, increasingly speaks a universalist language. The picture that I referred to, for example, it was designed in the latter part of the 1980s and then executed following a kind of an urban regeneration model. And the buildings, again, the quality of architecture and design notwithstanding, are anything but what you would expect as an Islamic iconography. They look more postmodern, and they don't carry any weight in that sense. So what could this mean? Despite a raft of political, administrative, and economic problems, development as a project is still unfinished, if it ever gets finished. The culture development link, however, has taken a different course. For reasons of expedience, economy, but also genuine lifestyle demands, like nobody lives in central courtyards anymore, for example, the place of heritage and its architectural expression is now changed. The state has abdicated its role in the production of an inclusive heritage. And by that I mean not a forced heritage, but something that collectively the people at large would seek to identify with, which one would presume would have been some sort of Islamic motifs. But in any case, heritage is a multifaceted process involving official and unofficial players engaged in transnational networks more often than not. Perhaps this shift in iconography and style suggests that despite ideological rhetoric, the state has failed or simply doesn't care anymore to produce widely accepted cultural expressions, which is in its own right productive of a common ground. That common ground, which brings the state and society together, is what the Pahlavis, the monarchy deposed in 1979, so desired, and therefore they were experimenting with these ideas. However, with that being abdicated, we can see that heritage has been flattened into depthless signs in endless circulation in ideological projects. Let me explain with the image on the right. You can see rather dull collective-looking housing in the background. These are apartments that you could find anywhere. In the foreground of this picture, you can see something that is a mosque. Mosques after post-revolutionary Iran, they're all ideological spaces, invariably associated with the government. That one, however badly, I mean, both of them are no good, perhaps, but however badly, the front one carries some sort of symbology and iconography, referring to quote-unquote Islamic, and the background, I don't know what it carries. In any case, as a corollary of this, fewer inclusive public spaces are being created. And we suspect that this is yet another unsettling expression of a growing state-society gulf in Iran, which any kind of gap like that undermines the stability of the state and society both. Now, in the end, to conclude, we have to also acknowledge our sponsors, which is the Australian Research Council, Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University and the University of Western Australia. And if you liked what we have to say, you know where to buy it. There it is. And also, we have to thank, once again, Rebecca Parkinson, Rob Byron, and the editorial team at Manchester University Press. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali and Nigel. I hope everyone here agrees that was a great presentation and learned a lot. I certainly did. Everyone's being very shy in the chat. We don't have any questions yet, so we'll give everyone a couple of minutes before we close the session. I have a quick question for you both, which is a horrible question that I know authors hate, but what are you working on at the moment now that you've this book is now out in the world and you're free-ish?
Well, we could mention one thing that's connected to it. A lot of the projects that were designed in the 1970s under the Pahlavi government remained either as remained on paper or were commenced but not finished. And following that, there were decades through the revolution and then into the period of the war through to the middle to the late 1980s when they just stayed in abeyance as ruins. And we visited one of these on a visit to Iran in Basagada. But subsequently, they were taken up and architects working for the government were commissioned to complete the projects. There's no documentation of these projects. If you look online, you won't see drawings, you won't see an archive, you'll see grainy photographs. And so we thought it would be interesting to forensically reconstruct these projects as they were intended in the 1960s and examine them for what they might reveal about the kind of the dream or the imagination of the state that they were intended to embody. Ali, would you like to add to that?
No, I think you did it perfectly. That's one of the projects that we have ahead of us. We've worked on a couple of other things that are small projects, but this one is a larger one. And of course, each of us has their own individual work as well, but we always look forward to the pleasure of working together.
Yep, indeed.
Well, that sounds incredibly exciting, and I'm sure we'll have to do another webinar when you finish that project as well, so you can tell us about how it's gone. But yeah, if there's no other questions, I think we will leave it there for today. So thank you again, Ali and Nigel. The book, as they both have just said, is available now, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.